Harold Sakata, the 284-pound wrestling sensation from Hawaii, is heading for a new career. If he passes his screen test, he'll play a murderous muscle man in the new James Bond movie thriller, Goldfinger.
Hello and welcome to Camel Clutch Cinema, the podcast where we talk about movies that star wrestlers or have wrestling in them. I'm Guy Hutchinson.
And I'm Craig Cohen. On this episode, we are talking about Goldfinger, the third movie in the James Bond series. And before we get started, just be forewarned that this discussion is going to have spoilers.
All right, and we're talking about Goldfinger. We'll get into the wrestling connection in this later, but let's talk about James Bond as a whole. I'm a James Bond fan. I know you're a huge James Bond fan.
Yeah, I would almost call myself a James Bond fanatic.
All right, now how does this rank for you? A lot of people say this is the best film, and not only that, a lot of people think this is the first one.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of people will most of the time they'll forget, not Dr. No, but they'll forget number 2, which was From Russia with Love. I would rank Goldfinger in my top 5. I think it's damn near a perfect James Bond movie.
It puts everything together. We kind of talked, I think we may have mentioned this, and if we didn't, retroactively pretend we did. I think Rocky III is the Goldfinger of that series. This film, they got everything together. You know, the first James Bond, they don't do the title sequence the way that they do it in all the other ones. They don't have all the I's dotted, and they haven't figured out exactly how everything plays. And by the time you get to this one, this film really does it up.
Oh yeah. And you start, you get the gadgets. You really just got the template is pretty much set here.
You and I, a few months ago, we did something really awesome. We sat back and we watched all of the James Bond opening sequences.
Right. Yes. You know what? I had completely forgotten about that till now. That was awesome.
Yeah, it was a really neat idea. So, every James Bond starts out, they have an opening. Why don't you describe how this works for anybody that has seen James Bond films but haven't really thought about it?
Yeah. Normally they'll start a James Bond movie with an opening sequence that is either the end of another mission that Bond was on or, just an action set piece that doesn't really tie into the movie. Some of the movies they've done that, especially the more recent ones, I guess just to conserve screen time. But it's really just a way to drop you right into an action sequence, have a clever way to introduce Bond, and lead to the opening title sequence.
So let's get into the next thing, which is the day this is coming out, the day people are listening to this. If you're listening in the future, then think back, because right now, James Bond new movie comes out today.
Yes, Skyfall.
And so November 9th, 2012, brand new James Bond film, the third one with Daniel Craig. Tell me a little bit about this one.
From what I understand, and I've actually stayed pretty in the dark regarding spoilers for this movie.
I like that. That's what I try to do with a movie, because then you go in and you don't, if you haven't watched the trailer 30 times, you don't remember the trailer gags.
But the gist of what I've taken away is that a deep, dirty, dark secret from M's past comes out, and Bond has to take care of business.
All right. Well, let's talk about Goldfinger. Go ahead and give me the plot summary right off the back of the DVD.
Yes, I got the DVD right here. Special Agent 007, Sean Connery, has just come face to face with one of the most notorious villains of all time. And now he'll have to outwit and outgun the powerful tycoon to prevent him from cashing in on a devious scheme to raid Fort Knox and obliterate the world economy.
Ooh, sounds exciting. Yeah. So this movie came out in 1964, September 17th. Long time ago. This is about 11 years after President Kennedy was shot. And I understand that President Kennedy was a big James Bond fan. I don't know if you know that.
But 11 years?
Right? Isn't? Oh, no, 1 year. So this is 1 year. This is 1 year after it came out. And the reason that's significant, apparently this was his favorite of the books.
Yeah, I do remember hearing once that once people found out that Kennedy was a fan of the James Bond books, the sales went through the roof.
Mm-hmm. You know what? I'm actually thinking it may have been From Russia with Love, which came out the year before this, but was still in theaters at this time. That may have been his favorite. But he was a big fan of this series, and this came out about a year after he died. So that should give people a time frame for it. Made $51 million at the box office, which back then was astronomical. What would that be today?
if you adjusted the gross, it would put it at number 42 on the all-time box office list.
Which is very high. I mean, you know, if you look at the box office list, most of the films, you know, in the top 50, even adjusted, are modern films. And the reason for that is that they put, you know, you have 20 screens showing the same movie in the same town. But this was a huge hit. I remember hearing that at Grauman's Chinese Theater, and this may have been anecdotal, but the world's famous Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, they showed this around the clock for about a month because it was so big.
Yeah, and I think we'll see how big this movie really was when we compare it to other movies in the top 10 that year.
Well, let's do that. My Fair Lady, top film of that year, its gross was $72 million, which is a huge amount. But this, right at number 2, $51 million.
Mm-hmm. And we talk about that $72 million number. Jaws, if I remember correctly, really started the summer blockbuster movie, and Jaws was the first movie to gross over 100 million domestically, right?
Yeah, I believe that's right. And Jaws was also the first one. It may have been The Godfather, actually, but around that time, Jaws was the first one, unlike The Godfather, that was appealing to teens. That was the first one of the summer blockbuster that we know, which is a movie where they're trying to get all the teenagers to go see it.
Yeah, with a huge marketing machine too. Yeah.
Mary Poppins was number 3, which everybody's seen. It's a wonderful Disney film. And then number 4 for that year was From Russia with Love.
Very interesting. Just to show you the longevity of those films,
Yeah. Think about that. So From Russia with Love comes out the year before, but is still cranking away the following year, making enough money to rank, right at number 4 in the top 10 for the next year. And it also shows that audiences were seeing James Bond and then seeing James Bond a year later, which is really fast for sequels.
Yeah. And this also, I think, really helps illustrate for people that weren't around like me and you and people who were even younger, that James Bond cinematically was always a phenomenon.
Right. Yeah. This is
it wasn't one of those things that slowly grew. It boom. It was big. It was bigger than the Beatles, as we'll see later in the top 10.
Yes. All right. So let's run through some more. Carpetbaggers was a movie that George Papard was in, who starred in the A-Team with Mr. T, who was at WrestleMania. So that's a slight wrestling connection there. Number 6 and 7 for this year were 2 of the Pink Panther films, A Shot in the Dark and The Pink Panther, which I guess was the secondary espionage type series of this time.
Yeah.
And then number 8, Viva Las Vegas, starring the Honky Tonk Man. No, starring Elvis. I had that wrong. Starring Elvis. I get them confused a lot.
Sure.
And then there was a movie called Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, which I've never seen, with Bette Davis, but anything with Bette Davis is probably good. And then number 10, The Beatles with A Hard Day's Night.
Yeah.
Only made $6 million, which just doesn't seem like enough for although Hard Day's Night had probably been cranking around for 3 years at this point.
Yeah, that was the thing. I was gonna, try and remember when that came out.
Yeah, Hard Day's Night. I mean, this was probably, a film that had been really making money. That Richard Linklater, right? Richard Linklater directed that.
Richard Lester, yeah.
Richard Lester. Now, Richard Linklater is the Slacker guy.
Yes.
Okay, no, he certainly did not. He wasn't born yet. But the Beatles also mentioned in this film. James Bond doesn't like the Beatles.
No, of course not. And, that's Bond for you.
Early in the film, there's a scene where he's like, "It's just like listening to the Beatles without earplugs," which I'm so used to people calling earbuds earplugs that I was like, yeah, he wants to rock out to some Beatles. And then I was like, oh, no, he wants plugs so he doesn't have to hear the Beatles.
Yeah.
Tell me about the director of this. He's noted for this film, right?
Yeah, Guy Hamilton. He went on to direct a total of 4 Bond films. He was, very important in shaping the cinematic version of James Bond. He also directed a couple of notable films, including Remo Williams' The Adventure Begins in the 1980s. He was also the original...
Well, you know what? Before you get past that, that's a film that was intended to be an American James Bond series.
Oh, yeah. Hence the Adventure Begins, and we never got the continuation, sadly, because it's a pretty good movie.
It's a lot of fun. So what are the other ones that he did?
Well, he was the original director hired for Superman, and a tax exile status prevented him from being in the country to film that movie.
So
and
wait,
he was also approached to direct Batman in 1989.
So Richard Linklater stepped in and directed
Yes.
Superman, right?
Yes. Overall, Guy Hamilton directed a total of 23 films.
So, but was Richard Lester the first Superman, or was he was the first one or the second one? He was the second one.
He was the guy that came in to clean up Donner's mess after, I guess they fired Donner from Superman 2.
All right, who wrote this movie?
Another important Bond figure, Richard Maibaum and Paul Den. Maibaum was involved in the scripting of 13 Bond films, starting with the very first entry in the series Dr. No.
Wow.
Yeah, so he went on to have a lot of influence over the stories and the plots of the Bond movies, which really deviated from the books a lot of the times. They would just use the title, and the plot would sometimes not even resemble it, or they would take a plot from another book in the James Bond series and put it into a movie with a different name.
Oh, absolutely. And they would even, just steal little pieces from, one book. I mean, even at the end of this movie, and again, we'll get there, but there's a golden gun at the end of this. I mean, there was a lot of, lifting things from one book and putting them into another movie. The reason why we're talking about this is a man named Harold Sakata, who was wrestling as Tosh Togo around this time and after and before.
Mm-hmm. And he plays the role, probably one of the most popular James Bond henchmen of all time, Oddjob.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. The only other two that I would even put on the same plane are Harvey Villanchez as what was his character's name? Knick-Knack.
Yeah.
And also Jaws. I would put Jaws up very high. But
yeah, Jaws who ended up having a face turn and died a hero.
Yes. But you gotta go with Oddjob. I mean, just fantastic. He is such a presence in this film, and I don't think he has a single line.
No, his character is a mute.
Yeah, so he was born in Hawaii in the 1920s, was a wrestler and a very accomplished wrestler. We have a list of his credits, which had, the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling champion. He was the NWA Texas heavyweight champion. He had a lot of different belts. I got to watch a couple of his matches on YouTube. I got to watch a match with Stan Hansen, got to watch a battle royal he was in, and a couple other matches. A really good athlete in the ring, really athletic man, and he had a background in the Olympics.
Yeah, actually in 1948 he competed for the USA in the Olympics, and he won the silver medal in the men's light heavyweight division for weightlifting.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and it's not a surprise to go. They don't have pro weightlifting. You couldn't, there's not
Mark Henry.
Yeah, exactly. He was the Mark Henry of his day to a degree. He was one of those wrestlers, the Japanese stereotype of wrestling at that time. He would throw salt in his opponent's eyes. He'd do a lot of chops and kicks, and really, really, just a spark plug of a man, just a real dense, burly guy.
Yeah. Looking at his list of accomplishments, he looks like he did a lot of tag team work as well. And one name's jumping out at me here. The NWA Hawaii Tag Team Championship he won with King Curtis Iaukea. Is that Prince Iaukeia's papa? That is
a member of the family tree there of the Samoans that are well known throughout wrestling history, all the way down to The Rock.
Oh yeah, I completely forgot that. If you're a Samoan, you're definitely you're related.
That's right. Yeah,
in the wrestling world.
It is also interesting to point out he's Korean in the movie. He's not Korean. He was born in Hawaii. So he was an American citizen, although at that time Hawaii may not have been a state. And I did not pay attention in history class, so I can't verify that.
And he was of Japanese descent.
Yes. So let's talk about the other people in this film. This is a Sean Connery James Bond film. There have been quite a few men to play James Bond, but a lot of people find him to be the all-time best, the guy to turn to.
Sure. And the main Bond girl in this movie is Pussy Galore, one of the most famous Bond girl names.
We'll have to bleep that. How can you, Craig, can you say that? Did they say that in this movie? I can't believe that.
It's PG.
And I don't know how before we go any further, I don't know how they got away with that.
Yeah. I guess it was maybe before that word really had the meaning.
I guess. Or maybe it was just, the way he would say it, he'd be like, well, pushy.
Well,
he'd
they
kind
even
of pronounce it wrong.
There was a riff on that in one of the Austin Power movies where I believe, God, I wish I had seen those movies more recently.
Well, before you get into that, it is really important to point out how much the Austin Powers movies borrowed from the James Bond movies, and especially this one. If you're watching the Austin Power movies and you're looking at the stuff that they borrowed, the gags that they use, they're from this movie.
Oh yeah, and there's one real famous one we'll talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So Honor Blackman played Pussy Galore.
Now, you have met a bunch of Bond girls. Is she one of the ones you've met?
Unfortunately, no.
Now, is she still living? Do you know?
I believe she is, yes.
Yeah, I've never stood aside a Bond girl. How many have you stood by, and who have you been photographed with?
I've met a total of 4, and I met in pairs of 2. So the first set of Bond girls that I met were both from The Man with the Golden Gun, Britt Eklund, who played Mary Goodnight, and Maude Adams, who played Andrea Anders, but also came back to play Octopussy in the film Octopussy. 2 really, really nice ladies, and I actually had a bit of a a confusion with them where I wasn't 100% sure where to stand, and Britt Eklund got a little annoyed with me and finally just grabbed me and put me in place and then stood next to me. Good memory. And then more recently, I met Luciana Paluzzi from Thunderball, who played Fiona Volpe, who was a bad guy, a bad Bond girl, and Mariam Diabo from The Living Daylights, who played Cara Milivoy.
Now, I should mention, just because I want to throw it out, we've both also met 2 Bonds.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Right? We've met not Sean Connery, but we've met Roger Moore.
Yeah.
And we've met the other, the 2 that basically replaced Sean Connery. We met Roger Moore and George Lazenby.
Yeah. And
now, do you say Lazenby or Lazenby?
I think I say Lazenby, and I think we asked him about that, didn't we?
I think we might have.
Yeah. He was a super guy. He really, he took a lot of time with us. He was, as he said, the best value at the place where you're at in terms of, pricing. Mm-hmm. But also an interesting note, he was Bond in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. When Goldfinger was released in the UK, like many Bond movies, at the end they say when Bond will return. In the UK, they said James Bond will return in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. By the time this movie opened in the States, they had decided that they were going to go with Thunderball instead and changed the title card.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
We met him at a convention, and at those conventions, what they usually do is they charge you to get an autograph, and they charge you to take a picture. And a lot of times, you'll walk up, you'll hand them $20 or $40, you get an autograph, you get a picture, and you're out. You're away from their table within seconds. He wouldn't charge to take the picture with him. He said, if you buy the autograph, you can get a picture for free. Yeah. And he sat there and chatted with us as long as he could, with the other people waiting. But he was really, really a nice guy.
Yeah, it's a great memory. Really cool Bond to meet as well.
But let's talk about the Bond in this movie, and let's talk about the film. How does this open up?
We get one of those famous pre-credit sequence where Bond destroys a drug laboratory in Latin America. There's some interesting moments in this that have been spoofed in other movies or paid homage to in other movies. At the beginning, Bond comes up out of the water in a wetsuit. He pulls it off to reveal a white tuxedo.
Right, which is pressed and looks fantastic.
Oh, definitely. And in True Lies, Arnold Schwarzenegger does something very similar.
Right.
Also in this,
actually, that's one of the moments that I really like in this film, because that to me sets the tone of these films, which is, I think, different from the ones they're making now, which is it's got a little tongue-in-cheek humor. There's a little winking at the audience that this isn't the most serious film you're ever going to see.
Sure. Yeah. And, I mean, he's got a duck on his head at the beginning of the scene.
Yes.
And also in this scene, we get a great moment that I think really defines Bond as a character. He's with a woman in her bathroom, and they're kissing, and he pulls away from her, and he sees the reflection of a thug in her eye, and he's coming up with a billy club or a sap, and instead of reacting by jumping out of the way, he spins around so the girl gets hit.
Yes.
I think that really speaks to Bond's character. And Bond roughs up women in a lot of the movies.
Yeah, there's some scenes that are uncomfortable. That in 1964, comfortable. 2012, not comfortable.
Yeah, and this moment was actually spoofed in Austin Powers' The Spy Who Shagged Me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So then get to the
we get to the first scene where they go to the hotel. We see Felix Leiter, and the hotel they go to is the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami. And when I went to WrestleMania last year in Miami, I made sure to go to this hotel. It's famous for other movies as well, notably Scarface, and I think it's called The Bellboy with Jerry Lewis.
Right.
But wonderful, beautiful hotel, and it really sets the opening scene in this. And it's well known as the best hotel in Miami. It was at that time. It still is.
Yeah, and it's so good to see that it is still there, looking exactly like it did in Goldfinger.
Mm-hmm, yeah. So tell me about Felix Leiter. This is one of my favorite characters in the series.
Yeah, Felix Leiter, he's been around for most of the 50-year history of Bond. Over the course of the series, 7 different actors have portrayed Felix Leiter. And the interesting thing is, in all the movies, he shifts in age and race. He'll be younger in certain movies. He'll be black in certain movies. Notable Leiters include Jack Lord from Hawaii Five-0, and more recently, Jeffrey Wright. He's the current Felix Leiter, and with Skyfall, he'll set the record for the most times playing the character.
Which is how many?
Before the new movie, he was tied with David Hedison, who played the character 2 times.
That's crazy.
Hedison's 2 portrayals, though, are notable in that they occurred 16 years apart.
That's even crazier.
Yeah, so with Skyfall, Jeffrey Wright will play the character for the 3rd time, setting the record.
Wow, okay.
And also, another interesting note about Felix Leiter is he did disappear from the series for a while. For some reason, he does not appear in any of the Pierce Brosnan films. Instead, Joe Don Baker played the role of CIA agent Jack Wade.
There is a very good reason for this.
Because he was fed to the sharks?
No, that's not it. Joe Don Baker is related to, I believe, the Broccoli family.
Ah, okay. That would explain why he popped up in one movie as a bad guy.
Yes.
And came back to play Jack Wade.
He's got a relation to someone making this film. I don't remember making the series. I think it's the Broccoli family. And is that broccoli or broccoli?
I've always said it broccoli.
It's got to be broccoli. It's much more fun that way.
Yeah.
So we get Jill Masterson. There's the scene with Goldfinger, who so resembles the Gold member character from Austin Powers. And we get introduced to her. And then not long after that, we get her covered in gold paint.
Yeah, and this is also the first appearance of Oddjob. Mm-hmm. Bond meets and quickly beds Jill Masterson.
Right. She
pretty much helps Bond defeat Goldfinger, who is cheating at a game of cards. So after they sleep together, he's going in the fridge to get I guess some new champagne, and Oddjob comes back and karate chops him in the back of the head. And then when he wakes up, of course, we have that iconic scene where Jill Masterson is just dead and covered in gold paint.
Connery says it actually hurt when he got hit. He said Sakata didn't pull his punch very well.
Well, you know what? It made for a great scene. Paint is temporary. Film is forever.
Mm-hmm. The Eugene Register Guard from August 18th, 1971. There was a nice article where they talked about Harold Sakata, and I'm going to read a section from this. He says that once I even used the Derby to get into France. I had mislaid my passport, but customs took one look at the hat and waved me on in. And when I was caught in Lebanon during the Six-Day War in the Middle East in 1967, it helped me get out among the first travelers. Now I carry it with me always on all my professional wrestling tours.
Oh, that is great.
So the hat that he would throw and chop people's heads off with helped him very much. But that's not what he uses here. He uses gold paint. Everybody's talked about this. It's fiction. But when I saw this the first time, I really thought gold paint would kill you.
Yes. And actually, this is a scene that has been spoofed in another Bond movie. In the last Bond movie, Quantum of Solace, there's a very similar scene where a girl who is one of Bond's girls is actually killed and covered in oil.
Ooh, that sounds sexy. All right. So let's go over. We go over to London. We learn the mission, which is kind of confusing. It has to do with he wants to ruin the gold more than actually steal the gold. But none of this really matters because if you're watching the film, you're just looking at explosions, actions, fights, things like that. You get to see Oddjob crush a golf ball with his bare hands, Craig.
Yeah. And this is another great thing in Bond movies where you actually have in this scene, Bond and Goldfinger play golf together and they bet on it. But you actually see the villain and Bond interacting socially, not as enemies.
Right.
You know, there's some talk during it. You can tell they're enemies, but they're being social. And Bond is one of the only series to do this where the villains are really a lot of times they're humanized and you get to see their human side. And you also get to see Bond interacting with them in a non-confrontational manner, which is very, very cool.
Yeah. Goldfinger is the goofiest villain. I mean, he's an unappealing human being. You know, he's a sweaty, portly kind of man. And Bond cheats at golf to beat him.
Yeah, which is how we end up with the I think Bond cheats after Goldfinger's cheated.
Well, Goldfinger, yeah. Well, okay. Goldfinger was cheating at cards earlier. Obviously, he's cheating at golf. But Bond comes up with a plan. You know, he hides his golf ball and then wins the golf game because he wasn't playing the same ball at the beginning that he was playing at the end. And this is when Oddjob has this great moment where he crushes a golf ball into dust with his bare hands.
Yes. But Bond tosses it to him and says, "Oh, I think I found your golf ball." and Connery's reaction shot is priceless as well. We should probably talk about the actor who played Goldfinger real quick.
Sure.
Probe. He was a German actor, and he's seen in this movie, but he's not heard. His voice was actually dubbed later on by an actor named Michael Collins due to the fact that Gert wasn't fluent in English.
Oh, interesting. So I guess it was one of those things where audiences couldn't understand it well, and they went ahead and dubbed it. That's interesting.
And I mean, you watch the movie, and you really couldn't tell. I mean, it looks like the voice that should be coming out of his mouth.
Absolutely, yeah, I totally didn't know that. Well, there's the subplot with Tilly Masterson, who's the sister of the girl who was painted gold, and she comes back to try to kill Goldfinger.
Yeah.
We've got Goldfinger melting down gold and smuggling it in his car. He makes parts of his car out of gold.
Yes.
We get this Operation Grand Slam, which Bond doesn't understand, but it comes into play later where he pretends to understand what it is. It's a convoluted plot. The best of James Bond plots of the villains are always convoluted. And there's a scene where Tilly and Bond get captured, and then Tilly gets killed by Oddjob.
Yeah. And this is another trend in Bond movies where we see that it really doesn't pay to align yourself with Bond if you're a female. Yep. Throughout this series, a lot of women have died because of Bond, and
yes.
You know, in some of the movies they even address it, and I think M even references it in GoldenEye, the first Pierce Brosnan movie.
Well, I think the rule is that you can't be the first one in the movie. You have to be the second one. You have to meet Bond halfway through the movie, and then you're good. But if you meet him early in the movie, you got problems. And there's two girls that meet him early in the movie in this one, and both of them don't do well.
And sisters to boot. I mean, God, think of the family.
So Bond is tied to a table. There's a laser slicing him in half. Very satirized because he gets Goldfinger, but he's like Operation Grand Slam, and he gets Goldfinger to tell him stuff, which originally Goldfinger didn't want Bond to talk. That's the famous line from this.
Yeah, I don't expect you to talk. I expect you to die.
You know what's funny about that is I've always remembered that line the way people repeat it, which is he says, "Do you expect me to talk?" And he's like, "No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die." Yeah. And then I listen to it and he's like, "No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die."
Yeah.
So he spares Bond and then he puts him on his jet and they go to his stud farm, which is near Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Yeah, and this is also where we meet Pussy Galore.
Right. And I'm going to jump ahead quickly because I think this is important. they still were in Miami to shoot this. And the reason that I believe this is because when they're at the KFC, you see Felix Leiter at the KFC. The KFC is in Miami.
Oh, that's great.
I found this KFC online, and it's still a KFC. It's in the ShopRite Center on 701 Northwest 119th Street in Miami, Florida, and it's still open. Sadly, they don't have the giant picture of Colonel Sanders out front, but it's still there.
That's pretty amazing, though. 50 years later, almost 50 years later, that it's still the business that it was in the movie.
So we get the $1 million. He gasses those mafioso. There's a lot of action here. Bond, I guess, gets away, then gets recaptured, and he tells Goldfinger why the plan's not going to work, and then he finds out that it really doesn't matter. He doesn't want to steal the gold from Fort Knox. He wants to make the gold useless for 58 years because the government in England runs their economy on gold, and if they don't have there's a whole lot to this, but basically he's got an evil plan, and he's got an awesome henchman who was a former wrestler to back it up.
Yes.
Talk to me about Pussy Galore's flying circus. I love this part of the movie.
Yeah, it was Pussy and a bunch of her.
Fun. It's a lot of fun. It's an interesting twist on the film that you get this, these planes.
Yeah, and they basically they're originally used to distract most of the military, and then a nerve gas was released that we think or that Goldfinger thinks is knocking them out, but it's of course a harmless substance that was switched out by Bond and Pussy after he seduces her.
So they go into Fort Knox eventually, and they weren't allowed to shoot there. What did they do?
Well, it's funny. Ken Adams, the production designer, was able to go out on location, and they wouldn't let him in. So his design was based on producer Albert Broccoli's wishes to see, quote unquote, a cathedral of gold, and then his speculation as to what the real Fort Knox might look like inside. And he did a tremendous job, regardless of whether it really looks like that or not.
Right. This is what you would hope that Fort Knox would look like inside. Gold stacked up everywhere.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful. Goldfinger arrives in a helicopter, and he's got this atomic device, which he's going to use. And I now have another article. This one's from a month later, September 22nd, 1971, from the Rochester Sentinel. And I'm going to read one paragraph directly from it.
Okay.
Harold, and this is Harold Sakata, Harold said he was at first reluctant to accept the role of Oddjob. Being a winner in the ring, he didn't want to start taking falls for the good guys. But producers and the script assured him that it wouldn't be the case. And of course, he did go on to take the part, explaining, quote, "You see, I believe I do what lies in my hand," unquote. Mm-hmm. Which is to say, one thing often leads to another. And I thought that was pretty cool. I thought it was cool that he was so kayfabe that he was like, I don't want to look like I lost.
Yeah. And this is where we have some of a great Oddjob moment. Basically, Oddjob and another one of the henchmen and Bond get basically trapped in the vault with the atomic device. The one henchman starts freaking out. And Oddjob basically grabs him, and physically tells him, "Hey, listen, this is it. We're done. We're going down with the ship, but our plan is going to be executed."
Yeah, that is, that's a good guy to have on your payroll.
Yeah. He's a heel till the end.
Yeah, he's like, I'm going down with the bomb. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, he's like, this is what we're paid for, buddy.
This is a guy that you're like, hey, I want you to be a caddy. He's like, all right, cracks his knuckles and goes and does it.
Yeah. And that's another moment that really defines him as a great Bond villain. Right to the end, he was doing the job.
There's another parody of this character that I really enjoyed, which was in the movie, or not the movie, the movie Clerks. They did an animated series, which a lot of people don't remember. Yes. But there's a character named Leonardo who has a manservant who's based on Oddjob.
Yes, but he talks.
Yes, he talks, and he's got kind of high pitched kind of whiny voice. It's certainly not the voice you expect to come out of that. It's a very, hey, it's okay, we'll take care of it kind of voice.
Yeah, very underappreciated.
The series?
No, well, the series and also the character.
Oh, the character. Yeah, Leonardo is bent on world destruction and really doesn't care much for his assistant, his manservant. So Bond gets out of the handcuffs. Odd Job attacks James Bond, and this is great. We get a showdown between Sean Connery as James Bond and our professional wrestler Tosh Togo, Harold Sakata as Odd Job. A wonderful, wonderful scene.
Yeah, it's one of the most popular fight sequences in the history of the James Bond series.
Let's go to the Evening Independent from June 7th, 1973. This is an interesting article. They actually did a series of articles back in 1973 on his career, and they did one on him as a wrestler, and this was the one that I found the most interesting stuff in. I'm going to read right from the article. Mm-hmm. It says, it was half a dozen years ago in Brussels, Belgium, and Harold Sakata was beating the devil out of a local wrestling hero. The crowd was vocal. In a flash, one of the spectators was out of his seat. And then there's a quote from Harold Sakata that says, he was a madman. He jumped to the corner of the ring and popped out a switchblade. With one stroke, he ripped into the derby on top of the ring post, which was probably the hat that he wears in the movie.
Wow.
Right? It was probably sitting on the ring post. Mm-hmm. He says, with one stroke, he ripped into the derby on top of the ring post and then said something I couldn't understand. I could tell by the look in his eye that he wanted me next.
Oh, my God.
He didn't like Goldfinger. He didn't like my role as Odd Job, and he hated me for beating up on the local. I was sweaty and I was scared, and I knew I couldn't run because that would mean I'd lose face, and only a fool would go after someone with a knife. Instead, I let out a loud yell and charged. The guy was so frightened, he jumped down from the apron and ran out the door.
Excellent.
They later say in the article that at first, when Harold Sakata, Tosh Togo, started, he was a good guy, mm-hmm. and he said he didn't make any money as a good guy, so he became a villain. And he said, this is a quote, I was going to give it 5 years to make it. But at the end of 5 years, I didn't know a toe hold from a hammerlock. And so he said he was booked in England 3 times, and it was his third appearance in England that led him to the role in Goldfinger.
Yeah, so his professional wrestling career is a direct result, or Goldfinger was a direct result of that, which is awesome.
I believe it was Guy Hamilton who saw him and said, hey, this is the guy I want.
Yeah.
And so he says in the article, quote, after the movie, they thought I was crazy going back into wrestling. But by now, I was in demand. I could get 8 times as much. I wasn't greedy, but I wish there were 2 of me so I could wrestle in 2 places at once.
Yeah, and this is really, showcases the difference or how different professional wrestling was, almost 50 years ago, where, the business was very different and there was a lot of money to be made.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He continues to say, in one exhibition that he brought his derby into the ring, just like we were talking about before, and he said he gave his meanest look and he pretended to let it fly into the crowd. So he threw the hat that we've seen in the movie after the golf game can take the head off a statue. And he says 4 ladies were in the front row. One fell backwards. Another one fainted. And then he said, quote, it was a cheap stunt. I should never have done it. He says that he had the derby with him at the time. He was working on a movie, and the title they listed was Want a Ride, Little Girl. And I looked this movie up, and I couldn't find anything. There was nothing in his IMDb for a movie called Want a Ride, Little Girl, but I found it. It was a movie from 1974 called Impulse. That was the eventual title. Starred William Shatner.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I mean, this looks like an awesome movie just based on the fact that you've got Odd Job as a character named Karate Pete, and you've got William Shatner playing Matt Stone, which I believe is one of the creators of South Park.
Yes. I will say one thing about William Shatner is, regardless of whether the movie's good or not, watching William Shatner in a non-Star Trek related role is really, really a treat.
It really is. And it's the 1970s, so I'm sure he had awesome trousers, a plaid jacket. I'm sure his style was beyond reproach.
I'm definitely going to keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, it may be something we should talk about at some time. I have a final sentence from this, and that'll lead us right into the next conversation. Odd Job, Harold Sakata, Tosh Togo says, quote, "The greatest gift I can give my mother and my brothers and sisters is to show them that I'm leading a clean-cut life. I get out and I work with kids and problem children. I teach them athletics and life. It's the greatest thing."
No, that's nice.
And this brings us to the guy who played the character that was based on Odd Job in the movie Austin Powers, a man who was playing a character named Random Task.
Oh, no. Yeah, actor Joe's son.
Oh, man. I don't know if a lot of people know this. This was something you brought to my attention, and I hadn't heard about this. And I don't know how much of this I want to talk about because it really disappoints me.
Yeah.
Well, tell people about the character of Random Task.
Random Task is pretty much a straight-up spoof of Odd Job. He doesn't talk. He's a manservant of Dr. Evil. But instead of throwing a bowler hat, he throws a shoe.
Yes. And so they cast this gentleman, Joseph's son, who was born on my birthday, 1970. So I was born 74, but he was born November 22nd, 1970. And so you can send me a gift, by the way. It's coming up soon, everybody listening. And he was a mixed martial artist who was not very good. He lost.
No. Yeah, he was a loser.
He was in a couple UFCs. And he was best known for the 1997 film Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery. He also did a couple other films, but the crazy thing was...
Oh, my God.
And I don't want to cover everything on this. You can go to the wiki page and read it for yourself. But in 2008, he was arrested for vandalism.
Yes.
They checked his DNA, and they found out he had done far worse things.
Yeah.
In 1990. Yeah, way back in 1990, he was involved in this gang rape where they kidnapped this poor woman.
Yeah. And, statute of limitations and stuff had expired, but they were able to nail him for other things. And he's doing a life sentence.
Yeah, I mean, this guy. So when you watch that movie, the guy that makes you chuckle, he had already done this. On the set, Mike Myers is standing next to this horrible man that's throwing a shoe at him. Yeah. This man had kept this woman hostage. Really, really sick story, and I'm glad they caught him. But it is interesting that happened after that event had taken place prior to the movie, and they didn't arrest him until, almost a decade later, or maybe over a decade later.
Yeah, he almost got away with it. And since he's been in jail, he actually... it sounds like he killed one of his cellmates.
He did. He found somebody that was in the prison that he didn't get along with and took care of him.
Wow.
Yeah, really, really horrible. Nothing like our wonderful Harold Sakata, who wanted to give his mother and brothers and sisters an opinion of him that he was living a clean-cut life as he took care of children, problem children, and teaching them about athleticism.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's only think of him.
Yes. And now we have the moment where Odd Job, sadly from a fan standpoint.
Yeah, and sadly from a standpoint that he couldn't come back in another movie.
Yes. But we do lose him. He's electrocuted. Bond basically uses the hat against him, and Odd Job goes to grab his hat off an electrified piece of steel. It's like the bars that are holding the money in. And he kind of does the old grab onto it with two hands. Yeah. And there's a really, really interesting story on the documentary that's included on the DVDs for these movies are great. And it's amazing that they, as much double dipping as they've done, the initial issuings of these DVDs were loaded with about as many bonus features as you'd want. Yeah, let's put a pin in the conversation and talk about that for a moment. These DVDs, they've now put out Blu-rays, which apparently are beautiful, pristine, and you can zoom in and look at things in the background that you never knew were there. But these DVDs are very good. They look nice, and they really loaded them up. My favorite thing is the menu. Yes. When you put the disc in, you need to act like a secret agent yourself and activate the disc.
This was when DVDs were new, so they were exciting to people, and it wasn't a VHS tape, so they wanted to give you something. So it says, to activate Goldfinger, press enter on your remote now, and then it would just go dun 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 dun, dun until you finally pressed it.
Yeah.
And my goodness, I mean, I remember one time I put one in, and I was going in the other room to get something, and we were going to watch a James Bond film, me and my wife, and I put it in, and a lot of times with DVDs, you'll put them in, they'll show some trailers, and then they'll show the movie.
Yeah.
Well, this was the early days of DVD, and I put it in. I left the room. I come back in 10 minutes. It's my wife sitting there watching it, tell her to activate it, and she goes, "There's no activate button on this remote." And I was like, well, you know what? They shouldn't really do this, I guess, because not everybody is a secret agent back in 2002 or whenever this came out on DVD. But the DVD edition, if you don't have a Blu-ray player, if you have a Blu-ray player, go out and get the Blu-ray, absolutely. But if you don't, or if you want to get a bargain, these DVDs are fantastic, loaded with stuff.
Yeah, since they've reissued these, they pretty much reuse all of the bonus material, and in some cases they've dropped stuff that are off of these movies. But you get like 2 commentary tracks, and you get at least a 30-minute documentary.
Yeah.
Some of them even have radio spots. It's really great for fans of the movie.
Yeah, it is. It is good. I watched the DVD, and I was able to read like the street sign in the town where the KFC was. I mean, they were a really beautiful transfer at the time, and the documentaries, everything's great on there. And so on this feature, what do they say about this scene where Oddjob, Harold Sakata, is holding on to the fence with both hands?
Yeah, well, director Guy Hamilton says that Sakata's hands were burned during this sequence. He says that after
the electrocution, they've got fireworks going on.
So, Sakata was holding on, his hands were being burned, and he did the take. After the take, when asked why he didn't quit mid-take, Harold replied, "Guy, you didn't say cut, so I just hung on in there."
That is a pro wrestler for you.
Right?
That's a pro wrestler, because he is used to where that's all you can do. If you're in the ring and something goes wrong, you got to keep going.
Yep.
There's no second take in wrestling.
Yeah, and the sequence is wonderful, and, it's unfortunate that Sakata burned his hands, but much like when Sean Connery gets knocked unconscious at the beginning, it makes for a great cinematic moment.
No, it's totally great. There's a moment that happened in a wrestling match years ago, in an independent wrestling match, where one of the wrestlers died of a heart attack in the ring, and he was scheduled to win the match. So his opponent grabbed him and pulled him on top of him for the 3 count before the paramedics came in, because that's how important it is to not, break kayfabe. And that's what Harold Sakata is doing in this movie when he's holding on to those bars and getting fried.
Yep.
I'm disappointed when he goes every time. Every time I watch this, I'm disappointed that he's not coming back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I almost expect when you get the extra scare at the end, you get the extra scene, I almost hope that it would be him.
Yeah. But at least he did come back for at least one of the video games, right?
Absolutely. Yes, you do get to deal with him in that. So, and he's certainly a beloved character in the history of James Bond. And as an actor, he did quite a few films after this and TV shows, and a lot of them, it was him in this character. He was wearing the tuxedo, he was wearing the hat, and even for wrestling fans, Mr. Fuji, who was another contemporary of his, the whole hat and cane and tuxedo thing, that's based on this movie.
Right, yeah.
So tell me about how the film wraps up. Tell me about the bomb and everything else.
Well, of course, Bond eventually disarms the bomb, and he stops it at when there's 0.07 seconds left. So Bond saves the day. He's invited to the White House for a meeting with the president. And then, of course, Goldfinger has hijacked the plane carrying Bond. There's a huge struggle. The window gets shot out, and then we have an excellent James Bond moment.
Tell me about it.
Goldfinger is basically sucked out of the cabin window.
Right. The air pressure just pulls him right out.
Tremendous. And then Bond rescues Pussy Galore, and they parachute safely from the aircraft. A lot of Bond movies end with Bond and the girl, escaping something and then ending up in the middle of nowhere, and then roll credits.
That's how it goes. Now, you told me an interesting fact about this movie that related to another pro wrestler.
Yeah, this is not the only Bond film to feature a pro wrestler. Sadly, there aren't more. You'd think that with an action series like James Bond, a lot of wrestlers would have worked their way in somehow. But back in the 60s, in the film You Only Live Twice, High Chief Peter Maivia was in the movie. High Chief Peter Maivia, of course, is The Rock's grandfather. In You Only Live Twice, he played a driver that transports a disguised Bond to a headquarters. But he's also in a fight with Bond at one point. He's hit with a sofa. He wields a katana blade. And he's finally put down with a statue. He was the uncredited stunt fight coordinator for the film.
Wow, that is really interesting. Yeah, that makes sense that's what you would get him to do, though.
Sure, yeah. And I guess back then, those were the guys, that had, the skill set and the knowledge base to choreograph stuff.
Let's talk about wrestling in 1964. September 21st, 1964, I found a WWF card from Madison Square Garden, New York City.
I can't believe there was a card at Madison Square Garden. It's amazing.
The main event was the WWF champion Bruno Sammartino against Waldo Von Erich, which ended in a countout 34 minutes. That's a lot of wrestling.
Yeah, you got some serious time to tell your story in wrestling back in the 60s.
Now, there's three guys on the card that a lot of wrestling fans may not know ever wrestled. The first one, Freddie Blassie fought Bobo Brazil to a draw. A lot of people remember Freddie as a second, as a manager.
Yeah.
Also, Arnold Skolin, who was famous as Bob Backlund's manager, also a famous wrestler, he defeated Lou Albano. 5 minutes, 46 seconds. I barely remember ever seeing a clip of Lou wrestling prior to being, the manager of, guys like the Wild Samoans. I remember seeing stuff where he was the third man. Obviously, we talked on the movie Below the Belt, show him in that. But I don't remember, I wasn't alive at this time, but I don't even remember seeing footage of him wrestling prior to becoming a manager. But it happened, and it happened on this night in Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't something that they showcased in the 80s in the WWF when he was a manager.
Yeah, exactly. And the third one, Gorilla Monsoon. Gorilla Monsoon fought Bill Watts, another draw, which is interesting. But Gorilla Monsoon was a guy that when I was growing up in the 80s, and I'm watching Gorilla Monsoon on my TV, and I remember hearing from my cousin that he was a pro wrestler, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe this old man had once wrestled. And I couldn't believe that this old man was 400 pounds at one point in time and was a monster.
Yeah.
Really, really crazy stuff. Let's talk about James Bond villains, James Bond henchmen, if you will, and wrestling. Who today do you think would be a good henchman for a James Bond villain? I could see the Big Show any day standing alongside, some Goldfinger type character staring down Daniel Craig.
Sure. And actually, Great Khali, who's actually appeared in other movies, I think would make a great henchman. And also, I think
he knows how to job.
Yeah.
Yes. And I believe did Khali appear in Get Smart?
Yes. And
which again is a parody of a film like this.
Yeah. And he also has a Jaws-like face turn and goes out a hero. I also think, and this might be a weird choice, but I think The Miz, who has some acting experience, would make a really, really good henchman.
That's not a bad choice. I was actually, the weird thing is I was thinking Chris Jericho, who's kind of an older version of The Miz in some respects. And that is an interesting choice. Yeah, that's who I was thinking. I'm surprised that Chris Jericho hasn't shown up, during his acting run at some point, being one of the bad guys.
Yeah, and both of those guys have enough charisma to be pretty high up on the henchmen roster.
Exactly. Exactly. We did record the last show. And for those of you listening, you may remember the last show we were at a Moe's right outside of a movie theater talking about Batista in The Man with the Iron Fists, and we were saying we were both in darkness in our house, that Hurricane Sandy had turned out all our lights.
Yeah, she really did a number on us.
She really did. And so luckily today we are able to send this out to you because we both have gotten our power back. But we had talked about how we had no power and we weren't sure if we were going to be able to do this. And luckily we were, but we did get a couple letters from people that were concerned for us. And I appreciate all of them. I'm going to read a couple of them. One of them is from a guy named Piers Bronson.
Huh.
I don't believe that's his real name, but he spells Piers like that guy on CNN.
Oh, Piers Morgan, okay.
And he says, I'm willing to run an extension cord from Denver to New Jersey so you can review GoldenEye rather than Goldfinger. Love, Piers Bronson.
What a nice gesture. Unfortunately, we couldn't deliver.
Yeah, we couldn't do GoldenEye. We got to do Goldfinger.
Yeah.
And there's another one. Why don't you read this one?
We get, Gents, classic film. Oddjob may be the best henchman of the entire series. If you tap, I will tap you. And by that, I mean I will stick a beer tap into your head and pour your brains into a glass. And that's from Chuck in California.
All right. Well, I think that brings the all-important question. Craig, did you tap to Goldfinger?
I got to say this, as a lifelong Bond fan, I can't even tell you the first time I saw Goldfinger. So many of these Bond movies I saw probably before I was even forming memories. Mm-hmm. And I got to say that even the Bond films that I don't like, I still will defend them. And I got to say that, from frame one, I am not tapping during Goldfinger.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to give a long description of why. I'm not going to tap out to Goldfinger. For God's sakes, it's Goldfinger. And I agree with you. I think that even the ones that I don't like, it's hard to say that I would tap out to them.
Yeah.
I found a thread on the IMDb that I think we should talk about.
No, James Bond is not gay.
Luckily, that's not their concern this time. Usually that is, but today they wanted people to invent their own ridiculous Bond girl name. No. So they started a game where they were inventing Bond girl names. And I'm just going to read a handful of the ones I liked. Professor Cherry Pie, which is subtle yet sophisticated.
Yes.
They also threw out Juana Spanking. And also Head of Lettuce. It's another one that I really liked. This movie made me think a lot. The Goldfinger name, there's also GoldenEye, as we talked about, and The Man with the Golden Gun. I've always thought that if you take the word gold, you can throw it into any movie title, and it all of a sudden becomes a James Bond title.
Sure.
There is a website you can go to, randomjamesbond.com, which if you go to it, I want you to punch it up right now, Craig. We're going to see if we can pull up a couple titles. I'm typing it in right now, and I'm clicking, and the random title I got is The Spy with the Golden Spy.
Nice. I just typed in, and I got Thunderfinger.
Okay. All right. Let me do one more. Okay, You Only Never Live Twice Again.
Well, I think I just went cross-eyed.
So that is James Bond. What a fantastic movie this is. I can't say enough about Goldfinger. I really, really enjoy this. Let's talk about James Bonds as a thing.
Okay.
Who is your favorite James Bond? Do you have one single favorite?
I got to say this. I think, much like the movies, I could find good points for every Bond. Uh-huh. But I think the main ingredient that a Bond needs is he needs to have the ability to look charming and look good in a suit, but also have the ability to look like he could really kick your ass. Right. Connery obviously had it. I thought Dalton had it. And I thought, of all the Bonds, I thought that Pierce Brosnan really brought that to the role.
So are you going to say Pierce Brosnan's your favorite?
I don't know if I want to commit to that, but
because here's why I say that. I have that as the one that I was going to say is my favorite, and I thought I'd be having to explain myself.
Yeah. I think more than every other Bond, even more so than Roger Moore, I think that he had the look that really did the tuxedo.
I think Pierce Brosnan is easily the most handsome man that played James Bond. And there's some good-looking guys playing James Bond. This guy looks like a mannequin, but he also plays the humor well, and he plays the action very well. And I think he was lucky enough that they really, starting with GoldenEye, they took a lot from this film. They took a lot of notes that they wanted to hit from this film, and I think they did it very, very well.
Yeah, it was basically almost rebooting the Bond franchise after I think a 6-year layoff from the Timothy Dalton movies.
Yeah, I would say he's my favorite of all the people that have played him, and I feel that Roger Moore did most of the films that I like the best, including my favorite, which is Live and Let Die. What do you count as your favorite?
My favorite Roger Moore movies would be either The Man with the Golden Gun or Octopussy, which I both of those movies were movies that I really gravitated towards when I was young, and I still really gravitate towards now. I'd also rank Goldfinger up there really high, but actually my all-time favorite Bond movie is From Russia with Love, the second Sean Connery movie, which just has some great sequences in it. But it's really hard to go wrong if you pick a Bond movie off the shelf.
I think that's absolutely true. So everybody out there, if you have access to this one and you haven't checked it out in a while, watch it again. If not, pick any one of them. Go to TV. They probably are running them on TBS right now in celebration of this, and go out and watch Skyfall. You'll probably enjoy that too. Craig
and
Cohen.
One interesting thing here is I think a lot of people are really going to be surprised to see how much involvement in professional wrestling Sakata had. I mean, before this episode, I knew he had dabbled in professional wrestling, but I had no idea that it was his career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally want to revisit him again. I really, after reading this, I said, you know what? We've got to look at his filmography, and down the road, we've got to watch at least one more of his films, because this guy was a pro wrestling champion who became better known as an actor, and that's akin to The Rock, I would say.
Sure, yeah.
So, Craig Cohen, thanks again for joining me on this one, Goldfinger.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening, and we will see you next time on Camel Clutch Cinema.
So you want to wrestle, huh?
You're too little. We got ushers bigger than you. Leave. I got to take a crap.
Don't you see? Your skills plus my skills in the ring. Tag team.
Highway Patrol's is John Triton.
What are you doing up there?
Staying away from you.
No more rhymes now. I mean it.
Anybody want a peanut?
What's that smell?
Down goes Jimmy King.
Oh my God, a 4-post massacre. No one can survive this. This isn't even a pay-per-view.